All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is my extreme pleasure to have Mark Blyth in the Mixed Mental Arts Dojo, far and away one of the most requested guests. I hope that you are ready to have your ass kissed for the next hour or so.
I love the idea of being in a dojo and having my ass kicked.
And so, Mark has become pretty damn famous in the last couple of years. And we were talking about this in a little bit in the car. So yeah, do you want to just tell us what's happened in the last 2 years? What have you learned? You're not in the position that the standard stuffed shirt economist is in.
Yeah, okay. As we were also saying in the car, the reason if I'm famous is because the bar is incredibly low, right? So we have to qualify that one. So much of this is simply the effect of YouTube.
Yeah.
So 20 years ago, 10 years ago, even people would go out and give talks, and they would talk to people. And they go, oh, that's nice, or I disagree, and then they go home. And now you can put it up on YouTube. And then people start to send it around, and then they'll take little clips of it, and then that'll end up being Facebooked. And that's what happened. I mean, basically, the big one was sort of 6 months out from when Trump was elected. And there was this little clip of an interview I did in Athens. It was this 4-minute rant on Athens Live that basically tried to put Trump in context as part of a global wave of populism that had been building for 30 years. And this is the way the future is going to be. Don't think this is an error, an aberration. This is what's happening. And that resonated with an awful lot of people. I think it was 1.2 million Facebook shares.
Yep.
It got me on Fox. Go figure. And I tell exactly the same story on Fox, right? And I got conservative love mail.
Wow.
No, absolutely. Because, I mean, the story I'm telling isn't about, we're right, we're the liberals, we know everything, right?
Yeah.
No, they're completely complicit in building a global order, which has basically shorted the interests of their core constituents.
That's right.
I mean, the people who desert the Democratic Party and have deserted the Labour Party under Tony Blair in the United Kingdom, deserted the German SPD. Think about this. The German Social Democratic Party, once one of the strongest left-wing parties in Europe, the polls for them 2 days ago, when I last looked at them, 17 and 18% of the vote. That means nobody believes a word you say.
Well, and rightly so, right?
And rightly
because,
so.
I mean, so much of what happened is, in the United States, it's campaign finance. And what happened was that the Democrats realized that, the big money obviously comes from Wall Street. And so if you want the money to run a campaign, then you better kiss the ass of Wall Street. Well, that then puts you at odds with your core constituency. And essentially the core constituency has realized that you don't represent us anymore.
So me and Jonathan Hopkin, who teaches at London School of Economics, have actually just done a paper on this. And it's trying to think about this big transition from the very Labour-friendly regime we had from the 50s through the 70s, where profits were hit, but so long as you could maintain productivity, you could pay higher wages, bit of a virtuous circle, but it blew up in a kind of inflationary crisis in the 70s and 80s. Then you get the big neoliberal reset. And so we know this story, and we can tell the story about how populism emerges out of that, right? That's the Athens Live story. But we're like, what about parties? What about political parties, right? Because it's not just like they suddenly became venal, right? There was incentives there, sure, but what's the structural story? So the story we tell in short goes like this. If you go back to the end of World War II, what you had in many places was the expansion of democracy, even in Europe, for the first time, for real. There was a period in the period between World War I and World War II, which ended badly with fascism. But really, you get post-war political parties, big two-party systems, even coalition governments. And these are kind of parties of mass movements. They're connected organically to trade unions, small business associations, etc. And the people who ran these parties were very different. They weren't careerists. If you were on the left and you lost your seat in the parliament, you went back to the trade union. If you were on the right, you went back to the family business, right? That's what you did. Politics was a vocation, a calling, but it was connected to parts of society. Now, move forward to a period when you have this big inflationary crisis. You can't just keep doling out public goods to satisfy more and more people. There's a tax crunch, etc. Well, how do parties deal with this change in the environment? So think about it as an evolutionary thing. The environment changes, which organisms are going to survive? And it's what we call cartel parties. So what they basically started to do was offer less. And then they cartelized the system and they would agree on more and more. But the stuff that needed governing, you just gave that away. You gave it off to central banks. You pushed it down to regional parliaments. You went up to the WTO. And then you have this wonderful thing called globalization, which says, well, we can't do anything anyway, so why should we? So you end up with these very, very fragile states of affairs, these parties and party systems, that when the financial crisis comes along, Wow, huge environmental change. Guess what? What was right for the era of Bernanke's Great Moderation, suddenly long and wrong for that area. So 10 years out, people are saying, well, what's your answer to this? They don't have one. They can't have one because they're kind of structurally adapted to a world that no longer exists.
Yeah, they've evolved, and I'm glad that you're using the word evolution. It's certainly...
I think it is an evolutionary story. It totally is.
And also, I mean, the important thing about evolution is that, individual organisms, any one of us don't necessarily understand these huge, large patterns. And very often we're sort of trapped in some sort of bubble. And if you're living in a particular part of the ocean, you don't know what's happening in the other ocean.
Exactly.
And until suddenly this crashing together comes and suddenly you're confronted with this. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think the other thing, you wrote this great book, Austerity, which, what's so funny is I was talking with my dad the other night about this. Austerity is 3 years old. And then, I was like, and it's so prescient. Like 3 years, seeing 3 years in advance is now what constitutes seeing into the future,
right?
Right?
Much, yeah.
But I think the first thing that I think is really important to not notice about that book is this is all very personal for you. Mm-hmm. So because you grew up in Dundee. Your dad was a butcher.
Yes, and a fascist.
And a fascist.
Right. That's a bit harsh. But he was a working class conservative.
Yeah. And so, the changes that have come with, this neoliberal revolution have basically meant that the generation of Mark Blyth that should have happened, that were born in the 80s, didn't happen because...
Yeah, in terms of social mobility. So the story behind this we were talking about earlier. So I've got a line in the book that says, the reason I care about cuts to public spending, even though I'm basically at the top end of the income distribution as an Ivy League professor, right? Why should I give a damn, right? Well, it's not nostalgia. Mm-hmm. It's because society depends upon some kind of transmission mechanism so that people who grow up in the bottom have at least a chance in their lifetime of getting to the top.
Right.
And we've systematically broken, abandoned, beaten down, and given up on that. And when you use a crisis of private capital in the banking system as an excuse to squeeze public budgets, which makes those broken systems ever more fragile and ever more redundant, then the next Mark Blyth doesn't get to happen. Now, again, let's do this evolutionarily, right? At the level of the individual, who gives a shit which fish gets eaten in the sea? But if you basically make it so that all the fish die, everybody has a problem in the ecosystem. Right. And that's part and parcel of what we're seeing now. A couple of years ago, someone got on to me on the internet. She was watching my talks and says, you need to really stop using this argument that you're special and unique because you came from this working class upbringing and now you're an Ivy League professor. There are, in fact, lots of people like that. And then we had a conversation and I said, no, there used to be lots of people like that. But now when I look at the landscape and I look at the class background of the people that I'm educating and the ones who succeed, it's basically all of one ilk.
Yeah, well, and because you're at Brown, and, we don't have to get into specifics, but, I was at an Ivy League university and all the black kids are from the Upper West Side. Or it's not necessarily representative. And, I remember I had a professor, a teacher in high school, and, he just talks about growing up in the north of England. And, there was a very chance encounter that he had where somebody said, you could go to Oxford. And he looked at him like you were fucking nuts. Like
you could go to the planet Rebulon and you can mine Decadal. Yeah, exactly.
So, even though, I think that's the important thing to realize is that, and this is where that social intelligence comes in, right? It's not necessarily that, the people who voted for Trump or voted for Brexit understand any of these sort of macroeconomic concepts, but they understand that the system isn't working.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? So you're being asked... So just put it from the point of view of any sort of person in the middle of the income distribution in Britain who doesn't live in London, right? So things are okay in the sense that you're levering the hell out of yourself. You're borrowing endlessly, whether it's through housing, whether it's through credit cards. Your wages are not growing in real terms, right? But everybody says it's the best of times. Now, you notice that property prices are on a tear, but you don't own one of those houses. Mm-hmm. You notice that some people are getting really, really, really stinkingly rich. In fact, the British government says at that time, we have completely agnostic about people making gobs of money in the financial sector so long as they pay their taxes. Mm. And then you can redistribute back down. That was New Labour's business model. But the problem is the financial sector lives on leverage, which is basically your borrowings. Mm. There's something that people don't think about very much, and I'll take a minute to try and explain this one, is that what banks call assets are actually liabilities. Because think about it this way, I own a condo in Boston, so that's great, that's my asset. To the bank, that's a liability. They don't want a condo in Boston. They're not landlords. They're interested in the mortgage, which is the income stream coming from it, which is their asset, which is my liability. So assets and liabilities match, go to zero, right? That's basically the story. So if you run a system that's basically heavily financialized, with people constantly borrowing, the banks are building up huge amounts of assets. But those assets are actually liabilities. So when you take Iceland, for example, before the crisis, and you have 1,000% of GDP as bank assets, well, that is 10 times the size of the economy. In IOUs, you might get paid back. So this is an accident waiting to happen. When the accident happens in 2008, the redistributionary model of New Labour blows up. Any philosophy that they have as to how you can live with sort of tearaway neoliberal globalized capitalism and massive inequality collapses with it. Their ability to understand why people in the middle of the income distribution in the middle of England are like, this system blows. Because for them it hasn't. This system has totally worked for the top 10% and above. But don't be surprised that everyone else says, well, it hasn't worked for me, mate. They may not understand the intricacies of the EU, but if you say to people, here's a straight shot, what do you think of the world as it is just now? What do you think things are going well? The entire elite lines up and says, you need to do this. It's super important.
Yeah.
Yeah, hang on a minute. Why do you guys all want it? Because you're the ones who've been making out with it anyway.
And so there are two totally different stories being told here, right? Like there are terms being used like inflation or asset bubbles or systemic risk or whatever it is.
All the camouflage, but ultimately what it's basically, they spent way too much money buying stuff, or they've lent too much money to people who'll never pay it back.
Yeah. And, there's essentially, let's take just those two narratives side by side, right? Mark Blyth is saying, this system, of course, it fucking blew up, right? Like it was designed to blow up.
Yeah.
But then part of what we talked about in the car, there was this famous line from this Goldman guy that essentially this was 10 standard deviations, blah, 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 which he basically is trying to pretend like, oh, this is a freak event. Nobody could have seen this coming, right? And the point is that is to essentially exculpate them, right? Remove blame, right?
So here's the good one about the banks, and I can never make up my mind on this. So part of me says you should never have bailed out the banks. Now here's the argument against it: systemic risk. Well, what does that mean? It means that everybody has lent and borrowed to everybody else, and everything's interconnected in ways we barely understand. And if you pull one thread, the whole thing goes down. So you have a country that's got 320 million people in it, and half a billion handguns. Is that right? Something insane like this. And there's no money in the ATMs next Tuesday. Well, that's going to go well. So let's not do that. Let's pump liquidity in the system. We have to do it. Too big to fail, right? That's the standard story. Here's the other version of this story. Horseshit, you're just saying that. Why can't we ring fence depositors? We already have the FDIC. We could basically take all the bits of the banking system that are to do with what's called payments, all the stuff that people actually care about, put a federal guarantee on that, let the whole private sector eat its losses.
Right.
So why didn't we? Well, because we weren't sure which world we lived in. Is it the world of systemic risk? Is it true? Or is it the world of systemic risk where it's kind of bullshit?
But it's not just that we don't know which world we live in. It's that the people who were making those decisions, one of those situations was very bad for them.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily, again, that, this is I'm a big fan of Hanlon's razor, right? Never attribute to malice what can be explained by stupidity.
Yes.
So, it's that if you're sitting there in that room and you're surrounded by a bunch of people, who also are very wealthy, also don't want these banks to fail, are very nervous because they are out of touch with, the middle and the working class. And, it's very hard in that room to float the idea like, hey guys, how about we all fuck ourselves and let all these banks fail? That's not going to be a story that's going to go over well in that room.
It's also not going to go over well with a large section of the public that really matters. So think about it this way. The other way to think about bank assets and liabilities is if the bank's assets are liabilities and vice versa, then what's inside the bank? The bank is filled with things like your pension pot, your mortgage. So you don't have to be in the top 1%, the top 10%. You just be in the top 20%. Right. That means you've got a 401k with financial assets. Do you really want to take a chance of that going to zero? Absolutely not. Now, we know from work with political scientists like Marty Gillens and others that if you look at the way that Congress votes and then you look at people's preferences and then you look at people's preferences scaled across the income distribution, your opinion doesn't matter for nothing until you hit the 80th percentile.
Right.
So 20% effectively make the decisions for everybody else. The only time that everybody else gets something is if you happen to agree with what the top 20% want.
Right.
Right. So that's the world all the time. In a crisis, it wouldn't be any different. In fact, it would probably be reinforced.
Yep. Well, especially because once you get into a crisis, you get a totally different kind of psychology, right? Now we're just so afraid about any sort of systemic thing. And I mean, there's a reason why dictator was a Roman concept that was for a time of crisis.
Absolutely.
So there's clearly something in our psychology that when shit is going wrong, like we just need to get through this no matter what, give all control to the one person or the small group of people so that we can get past
But it's
that
interesting the way
crisis.
that we do this now, because I mean, the way that sort of I'm struggling to find a word to describe this kind of transnational cast of people that run the world, the Davos select or whatever you want to call it, the sort of the slightly left neoliberal globalists, right? But the way that they've done this is they've delegated that role to basically technocratic functionaries.
Yeah.
So who are the most? So I have a couple of slides that I use all the time in talks. So let's think about the world for the 50s through the 70s, right? So what have you got? Relatively closed national economies, finance in a box, things you can buy, sell, and drop on your foot and trade internationally, good. Financial derivatives, stuff like that, bad, right? You run high wage, high productivity models, huge taxes and transfers, right? Nobody knows the name of the person who runs the central bank. Now, do the world today, right? Where we've been for the past 30 years. It's inflation targeting rather than full employment, right? It's low taxes and transfers. It's the globalization of labor markets. It's open economy. It's the complete opposite system. But at the bottom, everybody knows who runs the central bank. Now, isn't that interesting? Because it's meant to be the president, the parliament, the party, or whatever that actually makes these decisions. Who solved the financial crisis? It was the Fed.
Of course.
The Federal Reserve basically opened up what are called dollar swap lines, as many dollars as you want, folks, on whatever terms we'll give you, for as long as you want. And then everybody borrowed them. And that solved that kind of liquidity problem that was at the heart of it. It had nothing to do with Congress. It had nothing to do with Obama's stimulus. It was the Fed. Now, what you've done is you've given this kind of, there's a great essay by this actually, a great essay on this topic in Foreign Affairs by Jacqueline Best on the politics of exception. And how if you basically create a world in which you pretend that you have these functioning democratic systems, and it's quite clear when you look at it that they actually don't do anything, and you're constantly declaring an emergency and hiving responsibility off to these technocratic actors, they will become objects of political contestation.
Of course.
That's what's got to happen. And if they do that, and yet they're actually the only thing that's keeping the system afloat, you're really in trouble.
Well, but I mean, if we take the Martian view, right? Imagine that we don't have any vested interest, right? Which is basically impossible for humans to do. But imagine that, we look at the world after World War II, right? It's very clear there are these nation states, people have a real understanding of systemic risk. And obviously we don't want to go through what we just went through with World War II. So we're really focusing on creating a functioning system where everybody feels included. There are good systems. You have all the GI Bill, the Marshall Plan, all of that.
That in 1950, the most copied educational system and the most visited system in the Western world from abroad to take home lessons was the UCLA school system. Yes.
Yeah. Do you also know that in the 1950s, the big problem was that there were all these editorials being written about the fact that there wasn't enough differences between the Democrats and the Republicans.
Yeah,
They were so much on the same page.
And everybody right across the whole Western world was exactly like that. But anyway, I derailed you from your point.
Well, no, but I mean, so if you looked at that, and then you would look at, like, if you were to sort of try and fairly objectively classify the system that we have, and the result is that it's actually, it's a global oligarchy.
Yeah.
Right? We live in a global system. And, that's not working for a lot of people. And the response has been to try and go back to nationalism.
Yeah.
And I think that ultimately, we live in an evolutionary system. And, I think the way in which the globalists are right is that there is a certain inevitability to this process.
Yeah.
But the way in which they're wrong is that an oligarchy is not good for anybody. And essentially, as you've said so cogently, now that we have the internet and everybody gets a voice, essentially if you don't have economic power, what you're going to really use is you're going to use the power of the ballot box. You're going to use the power of Twitter. You're going to use the power of social media to have your voice heard.
Well, I'll give you an example of this. So there's loads of academic conferences and public policy type conferences going on just now, and a lot of them have panels or are actually called the crisis of democracy. And I keep thinking to myself, well, what crisis? People are getting motivated, right?
Yeah.
They're angry. They're talking about politics, and they're voting. They're just not voting for the people you like.
want, yeah.
So therefore, it's a crisis, right? It's like, okay, that tells you a lot right there.
Right.
What's really troubling about the moment is this kind of epistemic arrogance, right? Not that sort of, those in charge have got it right, because, let's go through a few things, shall we? Oh, the financial crisis, Iraq. Well, that was a good one. What else have we got here? Liberal humanitarian interventionism. That went really well, I mean, these people are covering themselves in glory to start with, right? But let's even shelve all that, right? Yeah. What we're basically saying is there's a bunch of people who have the truth about the world. And what they have is a particular moral judgment. They actually think the world should be this way, right? And that's fine. A lot of it I agree with. I can't be a racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I just can't I can't get worked up about the fact that somebody doesn't look white. It just doesn't do it for me. I'm sorry. I just can't do it, right? Now, is that kind of sense a truth statement about the world? Or is it a moral preference? I think it's a moral preference, right? And we live in a world whereby people are trying to turn that into a truth statement about the world, which means that millions of people who have different preferences for you, not just on race or ethnicity or identity, on these other reasons, they're wrong.
Yeah.
Right? That's incredibly arrogant. That's like communist totalitarianism in a sense, because what you're saying is there's a particular view of the world which is true, which is this theory of history. We've got it right. Anybody who doesn't agree with us is wrong. And that's the definition of intolerance.
Yep.
And basically it permeates, if you will, the Davos elite.
Well, and the I mean, we had this great conversation with Thaddeus Russell I was talking about before, and he had this fantastic line, which is that truth has always been the favored tool of totalitarians, right? The whole point of, communist propaganda or Nazi propaganda is to control the narrative. There is one correct narrative, there is an orthodoxy, and anyone who dares to deviate from that is an unperson.
And now we do it in interesting, more subtle ways in democratic societies. For example, the current furore over identity politics is one of them, right? But I'll give you a better example, or a different example. There's a slide I found. I love to poke around on the internet and find things like everyone else. And for some reason, I had Norman Rockwell in my mind. And, Norman Rockwell was once described by an Albanian communist as capitalist realism. Because it's kind of brilliant, right? I mean, it's this sort of like, everything is colorful and we're all happy and yes,
productive.
It's great, we're all productive, right? And I wanted to find something from the same period done by an officially approved Nazi artist.
Yeah.
And I did, and I've got this slide, so if anybody wants it, I can send it to you. It's actually in a set of slides I gave to the OECD. I don't think they like this. But anyway, it's like Norman Rockwell, only everyone in it's terrified. And it's just this look of this family where like everyone is absolutely terrified. Now think about what that is as state projects in a sense, right? One is boosting the case for sort of like capitalism and markets and Papa arrives home with the chicken in the pot and the whole 9 yards and the smiley kids, right? And the other one is the world's out to get you.
Yeah, of course.
The only thing keeping you safe is us.
Yeah.
Right. Now they're both constructions of the truth. That's it. There's no objective reality to this.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of that sort of desire to maintain the truth, right? And, I think part of it is it's just a technological function. In the 1950s, it was very easy to maintain a standard narrative, right? There were I lived in the UK when there were only 4 TV channels.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. That's when we had truth.
Exactly.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 10 o'clock news. This is really what happened in the world today. Luckily, no Britons were involved.
And the point is that it never was the truth. It was just what the standard story was. And obviously, whoever told that story told a story that served them particularly well.
Okay, but let's not go too far on this one, right? Because, ultimately, it isn't a case of like, so there's a certain event and there's multiple interpretations, Rashomon style, and they're all true, right? So, for example, Nelson Mandela dies, right? He died. That actually happened, right? So there's certain sort of like facticities in the world which you can't get away with. That's the old line about everybody's entitled to their own opinion. You're not allowed to entitled to your own facts, right? So let's take, for example, the BBC. When I wake up in the morning, I tend to switch on the BBC and look at the headlines, right?
Right.
Because basically these days, Britain's kind of an irrelevance as a global power. And, its government's covering itself in glory with, the people who brought you Brexit, right? So the comedy just writes itself, right? But more importantly, I can run through that and I can look at those things and this is what people tend to think is important from this part of the world. And, it's not that I trust their judgment. If I want to be depressed about everything, I'll just go to The Guardian and I'll look at the same stories and it's like, we're all going to die. We're doomed, we're all going to die, right? So you can spin it, but the facts themselves, there are facts. And what I do worry about sort of the plethora, in a sense, of alternative information sources, etc., is that we select our facts.
Of course.
Our opinions become the facts. And that's not healthy.
Well, and also, I think what's interesting, for example, about Julian Assange and everything that's happened in Russia is that you don't have to lie, right? All you can do is selectively report the truth. Like if I tell all of America's shit, but none of Russia's shit.
Yeah.
Well, now I look amazing. Right. And I mean, if you go on Russia Today, which I think Russia Today is pretty much, I don't know what state it's in, but I used to love going to watch the Russia Today documentaries about America,
right?
Because it's all about Vietnam and napalm and Agent Orange and slavery, right? It's the old famous Soviet line about well, they lynch black people.
Yes,
right.
absolutely.
So there's a moral equivalence, and that's how the story is told. But I think, Rashomon is the perfect analogy, is that we have to get really comfortable with the fact that if you want to start to tease out what is the story, you're going to have to listen to 7 different stories to start to figure out.
But here, in this particular moment, this is why this is important. And this is why inequality goes to the heart of this stuff, right? If you have a world in which basically, there's a great paper from the 70s called The Great Compression, and it's a statistical paper in economics. What it basically shows is that if you look at wages, right, in the 1940s through the 1970s, what happened was the top end of the income distribution came down, the bottom went up, and the whole thing moved up. So what you do is you create there a much more equal society right across the board. When you have an equal society, you don't actually need to have or seek out incredibly diverse sources of information. If those information sources are deemed credible by people whose material circumstances are similar enough that I can say, yeah, you would believe this too because you're a bit like me, right? But if I am so different from the other members of my society across lots of different indices, but primarily I think socioeconomically, then, what exactly is the news? So the other thing I look at in the morning is I always look at the Financial Times.
Yeah.
And the reason I look at the Financial Times is that's the one newspaper that I actually rely on, because you cannot run a successful business model giving information to the global investor class if you systematically lie to the global investor class. So they will tell it the truth as they see it in terms of what is relevant for that constituency to know. If you then look at the headlines of the FT and then look at USA Today, you might as well be in different planets.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So it's a question of there's multiple facts out there we can report on, but when your society is so polarized and so split, what counts as a fact is different. And what you're doing, what you're suggesting, is that in this moment we need to have not just the tolerance, the acceptance, the desire to hear as many different things as possible and to inform our judgments on that basis. And I think that's the only way, in a sense, of healing that divide.
100%.
Because it's not just an economic question, right? I think it drives so much of it. But to get past that, we need to stop basically sort of just self-associating with the opinions that we like.
Well, and I think what we need to do is we need to create a shared narrative,
yes.
right? Like whether it's any tribe, any nation state, you create a myth, right? And the myth is a myth that we can all buy into. It's a myth that hopefully approximate reality pretty well, and that ultimately we can all rally behind, right? That's what Muhammad did with Islam, right? That's what Jesus did with Christianity. That's what the founding fathers did with America. And it was a long, complex process to cobble together that myth. And you come out, you think, oh, I've got the story. This is the story. This is the story we're going to tell about us and each other. And then some people come along and they're like, fuck that story, right?
Exactly.
That's a stupid fucking story.
What about these people that excluded from your story?
That's right.
Right.
And so the point is, it is the process of evolving a better myth together.
Yeah.
And ultimately, in terms of that epistemic arrogance, what it really comes down to is, what is the ultimate arbiter in deciding what story we tell? And in the 1950s, the arbiter was essentially, the people who controlled the television stations, the professors that were aligned with them, and that, not being malicious, but just started telling stories that served them really well. And, you know,
Well, also, let's be generous, right? As they saw the world, what the stories they were telling were probably what they genuinely thought was true.
Right.
I mean, you don't have to impute any sort of deviance as, I know that the world's like this over here.
Right.
You know, until basically, I mean, think about Rosa Parks, right? So Rosa Parks is one person who's come to symbolize a moment of revolt, right?
Yeah.
But there were millions of incidents. There were millions of Rosa Parks moments that didn't become registered that way. Well, why not? Because society was blind to it.
Yeah.
And deliberately so. And even if it was deliberately blind, no individual was like, right? It was just, that's the way the world was. And because that's the way the world was, you don't see it. It's only when the environment shifts that you really need to to change your mind on those things.
Well, and specifically, you need people who are deliberately willing to create that shift, right? I mean, the Rosa Parks moment, I mean, you know, it was not a grassroots movement. It was astroturfed.
Yeah.
Like, they very deliberately found who is the nicest, you know, black lady possible with the cleanest political criminal record, cleanest all of this sort of stuff. And then we're going to deliberately set up this situation so that we can do this piece of political theater, drive a bunch of attention to this, and ultimately use that to start to change things.
And again, what does that point to? It points to the fact that what you need to do is not just build coalitions that are intellectual, but build coalitions and networks that are physical, that you're actually willing to take risks for each other.
Yep.
And that's something that we've managed to really destroy over the past 20 years. I mean, people, you know, my generation and before, you know, we need to build unions again. We need to go back to the 70s. I'm like, no, forget it. No, you can't do this. You know, the old line about you can't stand in the same river twice. You know? You can't, right?
Yeah.
So you can, I mean, in a sense, think about the Trump project, right, as a nationalist project. Now, Eric Lonergan is a guy that I write with, and we've got half a book manuscript together, more than half a book manuscript on this. And Eric's first observation, coming from Ireland, he's an Irish guy, is that nationalism is hardwired into us. But what matters is what the content of the nation is. And if the nation is basically a sort of an ethnic concept, right, and a large part of the Make America Great Again is a nostalgia among 70-year-olds for a world in which basically white guys get to run everything, right? There's no doubt about that. That's not something I'm signing up to.
Right.
But on the other hand, let's think about the left-wing version of this. I come from Scotland, one of the most progressive places in terms of integration of immigrants, etc., at least in the Anglosphere. Who runs it? The Scottish National Party, who are de facto a lefty party. So people in moments of stress, this is Eric's point, really instinctually go to the nation as a kind of holding pen for their emotions and their expectations. Who or what can I rely on? What is fixed in this moment of flux? And that's why, as you were saying about one of your relatives, you know, Don says he's going to make America great again. What the hell is Hillary actually saying, right? There's a clarity to claims about nationhood, who's in, who's out, that allows it to work. Now, with that, you can fill that with lots of different things, right? But what you also need to do is not just have a kind of internet community bubble. There needs to actually be physical contact amongst the people who are willing to do this type of work. And that's the bit that we're missing. And modern political parties, as we were saying earlier, think about the Democrats. Can I go to a Democratic Party meeting?
Yeah.
I wouldn't even know how to. I mean, where would I go?
And even, I mean, that we just had Larry Lessig on the podcast on Tuesday, right? And, you know, Larry Lessig ran to draw attention to campaign finance, and then they deliberately excluded him because there are certain things we don't want said.
That's verboten, right? Yeah, exactly. yeah, totally.
So, I mean, you know, and I think in terms of that shift back to nationalism, which is really a shift back to tribalism, right? And that's an evolutionary mechanism. So this is a thing that is, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of years old, and that evolved basically because culture is the toolkit by which you survive in a particular environment.
We're highly socially learning adaptive.
That's exactly right.
We're no better than chimps when it comes to cognitive recognition.
That's exactly right.
Also, you know Robin Dunbar's work on this?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We're huge. So, I mean, I shared with you the mixed mental arts belt system, and it's basically to draw together these core concepts. Yeah. And the Dunbar number is the orange belt.
Brilliant. Yeah. I met him at a conference, an incredibly nice guy.
Yeah.
And just, you know, you just start listening to him telling his story, and you just go, yeah, so much of that just makes, you know, intuitive sense. So I'm a football fan, right? Yeah. So, sorry, everyone. Soccer.
Fuck that. You know, Americans have controlled the narrative for too long, right? Well, it's soccer. It's football. Whichever the fuck you want.
Now he's been aggressive. I don't know why. Anyway, before I was so crudely interrupted. So I support a team called Everton, who managed to spend $150 million on players and get worse. right? Which is truly fucking epic. I don't know how they managed that one. But anyway, we've managed to do this. Now, the thing about it is, they're the other team in Liverpool. Liverpool, big team, blah, blah, the rest of it, right? And these are tribal identities.
Yeah, of course.
They deeply matter to people, right? Now, even here, where teams are franchised, which I just find fucking hilarious, right? But, here we go. It's the Baltimore Browns. It's the whatever Browns, right? Where the hell is Browns this week?
Yeah.
But people then still get attached to this.
Yep.
Because, in a sense, we need to have that sense of belonging. As society becomes more sort of distantiated, anomic, individualized, in a sense, partly, but not exclusively, the consequence of the confluence of neoliberalism and technology, right? Then you want to have these kind of wider identities. And in a sense, nationalism becomes the default container within which you fill in different ones, whether it's football on one side or whether it's, whatever it is you're on the other. But we can't escape our need for social connection and belonging.
Yeah.
And if you try and build a world in which, no, you're just an individual, right? No, just no. People hate that shit.
Yeah. Well, and also on top of that, I mean, belonging is probably our most primal need, right? There's this great line from William James that the deepest desire in human nature is to be appreciated.
Right.
Right? It's to have a...
Surely could only be written by a guy like James who was never appreciated.
Well, until after he was dead.
Exactly.
Right.
Oh, there you go. I want to be deeply appreciated before I die.
Yeah.
Just put that on record.
Mark Blyth, congratulations. You've achieved that because you are deeply appreciated within the mixed mental arts community. But it's also, I mean, the advantage that nationalism has is it's an incumbent, right?
Yeah.
It's the thing that we already know. And, the point is that the big problem, because I lived in Europe for a long time. I lived in the UK. I went to Eton College with Prince William and all of that.
Wow.
And it was very...
And look at him now.
Yeah, and look at me now. And it was just very clear that I would never belong there.
Yeah.
Like, no matter what I did,
it's not going to happen for you.
It's never going to happen.
No.
And, I had this conversation as well with my dad, who's Dutch, and I was like, listen, there's nothing that you're ever going to do that will allow you to fit within the English class system. Right. Because you're just...
Number one, you're too tall.
One, you're too tall. Two, you say what is on your mind, which is not fucking acceptable.
Absolutely not. She probably says it a bit like this. And yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and those cultural markers, stick out. Now, let's be social sciencey for a minute here. Hold on, you can't talk about nationalism and tribalism because we know that the nation is a relatively recent construction, and we have Benedict Anderson on one side and Ernst Gellner on the other, and the conflagration of modernity on the one side, plus publishing and lingua franca brings together. Yeah, all that's true, but the thing is, it's been around for about 300 years, and we have short-term memory disorder. So we accept as natural things which 30 years ago hadn't been invented.
Of course.
Yet. That's part of our adaptive survival mechanism. We can take things as real.
Yeah.
This is incredibly important in financial markets. Just for a side, I'll go out here to come back, right? So, let's think about today. So we have Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. I can never say his name. It's the same name as the guys who rode was it the bats? I forget what it was.
Flying monkeys.
The flying monkeys in the Wizard of Oz. I'm sure that's the same name. It's been bugging me, right? But anyway, right? So whatever his name is, so he talks down the dollar.
Yeah.
Right. Now, let's think about this for a minute, right? So the dollar is this very material thing, and people have dollar assets, particularly treasury bills, blah, blah, blah. It's the base of the credit pyramid for the world, yada, yada, right? And out comes like this guy, right, Mnuchin, with a non-serious name, and manages to basically knock 3% off the value of the dollar just by talking.
That's amazing.
Now, what does that mean? It means that people are extrapolating from his words into likely states of the future. What will happen and what will happen to the value of the assets they hold, given what everybody else thinks will happen given the same information. So we constantly project forward. That's how we live. This is the Kierkegaard one. We always live it forward in the moments of uncertainty, right? But in doing so, the fact that we have relatively convergent expectations is what creates the stability in the world in the first place. Now, why is it in a sense that we're also angry and pissed off? Because those expectations have become non-convergent. They've become radically different for different pockets of society.
Or even not only, it may not even be projecting to the future. It could just be like that on, our subconscious brains are picking up, like, he seems nervous. Like, he doesn't seem confident. Like, if you're picking up certain emotional or social signals, like one of my favorites of this was, when the Arab Spring was happening, right? So, Gaddafi, Libya was one of the last places for it to happen. Gaddafi is like being an asshole, but there's this hope that his son, who went to the London School of Economics, is going to be the moderating force and all that sort of stuff. And then he gets on TV, and his son does the thing with the fingers.
Right, exactly.
And the point is that, who the fuck cares what he was saying? Like, the fingers communicated contempt.
All you needed to know.
And it was all they needed to know. And that
was it, game's up.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and then they chopped off those fingers. But,
yes, indeed.
but it's, I think if we're going to have effective cargo cults, they, all societies rest on assumptions about human nature. And we have to get really honest with who we are.
Right.
And just be honest that, a lot of what we're tracking is these emotional and social signals. And we can hide behind whatever words or create whatever narratives, but it's, it's like the Democrats can say whatever the fuck they want, but it's like, what have you done for me lately?
But not what have you done for lately. You can say these things, but do they actually resonate with my life chances and my life experiences, right? So, I spoke about this in the car. There's a kid I've been corresponded with who has grown up, he's now 19, in Flint, Michigan. So, I grew up drinking milk, he grew up drinking lead, right? And he's incredibly smart, right? He should be walking into every Ivy League school. He's got 2 op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, 1 in the New York Times, and he gets rejected.
Right.
Right. So basically, what signals are the system sending him?
That's right.
While it's telling itself all these stories about inclusivity. Right, so there's 2 sort of things that we really need to comprehend here. The first one being, when you have such segmented life experiences, you can't have those convergent expectations, right? So you have to do something about the physical ways in which people live, right? And if you have highly skewed income and wealth distributions, really hard to do something about that, right? The second one is, if the narrative as to how the world works is basically captured by a bunch of people who think there's nothing wrong, that's an even bigger problem.
Right.
And those 2 things are basically where we are at the moment. And that's precisely what Mixed Mental Arts as a project is. Yeah. Is like, get the gap between those 2 things. That's what needs to be closed.
That's right. And, ultimately, if your view of reality is so great, it should be able to make sense of this story, this story, this story.
Yeah.
We're big fans of, or at least I am, I shouldn't speak for the community, but I'm a big fan of the famous story of the blind man and the elephant. And, that's very much where we are, is that everybody has their little story that makes perfect sense to them.
Yes, absolutely.
But the real thing is to wander around the elephant and figure out a narrative that makes total sense.
Absolutely.
And that brings me nicely to your book, Austerity.
I thought you were going to go, that brings me nicely to elephants. Which I was like, I am not prepared to talk about elephants. We spoke about this.
No, fuck.
We're not doing this.
No pachyderms.
No pachyderms.
No, but I mean, what I think was so fascinating, and this is a community that is very comfortable with this, is that, in Austerity, you talk about all these economic religions. And there are all these narratives about how the world works. And it's not that any of them is entirely wrong, right?
None of them are entirely right.
Right, yeah. So just to even talk through some of those, I mean, one of the things that I also thought was interesting as well is that, it's one Scot talking about some other Scots in the beginning.
Yeah,
right?
totally. Yeah. It's like so the joke that I used to tell was the Scots invented capitalism and then gave it to the English. and that's where the trouble started. So immediately I'm making a nationalist joke.
Of course.
It's inescapable, right? Yeah. So, all right. So the basic problem is this: if you go right back, this is one of the fascinating things about doing the book, was I wanted to do the intellectual history of what I call this dangerous idea. So you go back and you're right. Where do you start? Well, you start off with John Locke, and you start off with Locke's chapter on property, and he starts with this puzzle, right? So everything is held in common, and we're all creatures under God. How can we have unlimited wealth and private property? Well, let's do this thing about improvement. So he does this thing, and that's how he gets it. And then he realizes very quickly he's going to end up with an incredibly unequal world, and that might be bad. So then he has to do something he hates because he's a liberal. He invents the state. Because if you don't have a state that's strong enough to protect your property rights, then why would you ever invest to get your property, right? But if the state's strong enough to do that, it can take your property. So this is the tension. This is the American Constitution. Everything is written in this sort of classical frame. So the problem is when you come along and you get to like Hume and Smith and others, 100 years later, those Scottish Enlightenment figures, what they're figuring out is that this whole thing called debt is kind of interesting, because what you can do is you can issue bonds now, and somebody will give you real money, which you can then spend on a promise that you will pay it back later on. Well, if you give that to any politician, you know that's going to be abused. You know that's the case. But here's why they like it. See, if you want to have that, because you've got this highly unequal world now, and you've got lots of private property, you need a big state to protect that and police it and all the rest of it. But you don't want to pay any taxes. So if you don't want to pay taxes to protect your property, then you're going to have to get the income to do it somewhere else. Well, how about bond markets? Because then the state can issue bonds and it can tax future taxpayers. And I, the guy who's already got the private property, I can buy those bonds. So in a sense, I'm giving the state a loan that I get back all the money with interest. And the state then is able to protect my property rights. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Problem.
And also, it's sufficiently complicated that probably the people that you're fucking over
don't actually
won't
realize
understand what's going.
Which is still true, right?
That's right.
Right. So to recap, right, basically to make sure everybody's got this one, right? I have a problem. I need a state to protect my property rights. I don't want to pay any taxes, and I hate the state.
Right.
But I need a state, otherwise I won't have any income or any property.
That's right.
So I got to pay for that. I don't want to pay taxes. What am I going to do? I'll invent a bond market.
Right.
I'll get the state to issue bits of paper. I'll lend it the money. I'll get all the money back with interest, and then future taxpayers, not me, will pay for it.
Right. So you're setting yourself up for the ultimate within your limited human lifespan experience.
Yes.
I get to own everything. I get to have my property secure, and I pay for nothing.
Right. Now, let's jump forward to today. There's a piece in Foreign Affairs by a guy called Sandy Hagar that points out that for all of the shitting and panic and diarrhea that goes on about the US national debt, most of it's owned by the 1%. Why? Because it's an interest-bearing asset and is actually incredibly secure.
Yeah.
Because if the United States defaults on its debt, we're already in Mad Max world.
That's right.
Right? So we have this story about debt as being unproductive and bad, and it's from excessive spending and blah, blah, blah. You follow the history of this through. This is basically liberalism trying to pay for itself on the cheap.
But this is what I thought was, so interesting, right? Is that the point is that, the general public, right? My uncles don't understand this stuff. Honestly, I struggle to understand this stuff, right?
Yes, we like to keep it deliberately opaque.
And because it's deliberately opaque, what that means is that you can then tell me, it gets even better, because not only have you figured out how to have the most awesome bunga bunga party while you're alive, but you then don't have to pay for it. And then when things are bad, we're like, oh, this state has just behaved so naughtily. It's been so bad. So now what we have to do is really tighten the purse strings. We have to have this thing called austerity.
Yeah.
And, there was one of the things that I really loved, right? So even let's look at the language, right? Yeah. Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain.
Yeah.
Pigs. They're called the pigs. They're bad.
Or even worse, if you throw in was it Iceland as well? I can figure out, you get gypsies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you can go really racist on this one.
So you've got these bad, irresponsible actors who are fucking everything up, right? So now we have to bail them out. But there was that study done by the Germans where it turned out that 95% of the money that went to Greece actually filtered back to the banks in Germany. The German
banks that bought the Greek debt in the first place. Yeah, I mean, the sort of the empirical story of the book, and this is the other bit, the fascinating bit. I had a hunch that this was true, and then I was one of those ones just like, wow, not only is this true, this is super true.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing about, these states have spent too much and their unit labor costs have got too expensive, their lack of competitiveness. And it's like, this is bullshit.
Yeah.
Because you can't have over borrowing without over lending.
Right.
Right, somebody has to be willing you to lend the money. Now, why do they have an incentive to give Greece money?
Right.
It's still Greece. It's not Germany. And why are they paying so little interest on it, right? So you start to pull on that string.
Yeah.
And what you find out is that big banks, first of all, when you say big banks in Europe, you're talking about banks whose asset footprint, go back to that, their ability to cause damage, is twice that of your average American big bank.
Right.
These things are huge.
Yep.
Their leverage, their assets to how much they've got out there in risk capital is twice as much as American banks. And they've all got Greek, Irish, Portuguese debt. So imagine that you're running an institution that's got €500 billion footprint, right? Huge, right? Deutsche Bank. It's got 60-to-1 leverage on a typical Tuesday, which basically means it's got 2% in actual capital it can draw on if the shit hits the fan, and everything else is a promise out there in the universe, right? Now, you might not own that much Greek debt, but let's say Greece defaults. Everybody in the market dumps Greece. So what happens? You've got a hole in your balance sheet. So now you've got to fill that hole because you've only got a 2% cushion.
That's right.
So you have to sell something that's still got value before it goes to zero. So you sell Portugal. But if you sell Greece and Portugal now, what happens? Everybody else goes, I need to sell Ireland.
That's right.
And this was the whole fear of what was called contagion through the bond market. So what they were really doing when they're screwing Greece and all the rest of it was basically, once again, saving the banks of Europe from their own bad lending decisions. You never, to this day, in Germany, irony of ironies, the Germans gave me a national award for this book, which they've obviously never read, right? and they really did. No, somebody said, I got this email that says, Sergei Hita, Dr. Blyth, we're giving you this award. And I was like, somebody's taking the piss.
Yeah.
Right, this is a joke, right? But no, they give me a national award for a book they never read, and they're still doing it. I go there now, and it's like, well, the crisis is over, but we need to talk about the lack of competitiveness as the root cause.
Yeah.
And I'm like, the IMF has shown that that's bullshit.
Right.
The European Commission itself has shown that this is bullshit.
Right.
Why are you still saying it? Because the narrative suits them.
Of course. And, I mean, even when you talked about, in the book, you talk about, Smith and Hume, and they're telling the narrative that suits the merchant class, right? And, I mean, again, this is all very human. We don't have to, get into anybody being a bad actor. People tell the stories that suit them and their tribe.
But also, let's think about it, and let's take this forward, right? So I'm telling the story where debt's basically a class-specific put option, to use the language of finance. I get to basically have the assets and the asset security, and you pick up the insurance if it all goes wrong. And that's true, but there's also a productive story here. So let's go back to me being able to go to a decent school, going to a public university and becoming a professor from what are very sort of humble origins. Well, that's because governments issue debt. And then they build infrastructure and they hire teachers and they invest in skills and they do good shit with it. And then you end up with a virtuous circle world. And here's what I mean by this. Even though I live in the United States, well, imagine I stayed in Britain, right? How much would it cost for me to basically stay? There was no welfare state. What's my most likely outs? I'm in the army or I go to prison, right? Lots of kids that I went to school with went both of those ways, right? But a lot of us managed to get out. Now, at the level of income I am now, even in Britain, I would be paying 40 to 45% of my income in taxes straight to the government. So over a 5-year period at that band rate, given what I earn now, I have paid back every single cent that was invested in me.
Yep.
Right? And some. So you can have public debt, public financing, which is incredibly productive of human and physical capital assets. We're in the worst possible world. We generate debt and we don't do the investment.
Right.
So if you look at basically debt to GDP...
And specifically, we don't invest, I mean, not just in infrastructure, but ultimately in human capital.
Yeah, in human capital, you don't.
Right.
You don't
and
care.
And I think, if you break this down to sort of if we go back into our evolutionary past, and you think about this in terms of, within the Dunbar number, we've got our 150 people, our tribe of 150 people. What does this look like? Essentially, we're not mentoring people. We're not teaching the next generation of fishermen, the next generation of hunters, the next generation of chefs or cooks or whatever.
Well, in part, I mean, think about globalization into this one, right? So what has globalization done to the Dunbar number? It's increased it, probably, but it's also delocalized it. So of my 150, if I had to write them down, they live in London.
Yeah.
Right? They live in Berlin. They live in LA.
Right.
They live in Boston. Right? Few of them live in Flint. Right? My locale is Dundee.
Right.
There's nobody there now that I know.
Yep.
Right? Really. So, I am part of this global elite that I criticize. So my Dunbar number has become so transnational that it's disconnected from why I should care about anything local.
That's right.
And I think that's a real part of the problem is that when, people criticize this global elite, it's a real thing.
Of course. And also, not only that, your Dunbar number and my Dunbar number is superficially international. Because even though it's scattered across all these cities, there's a sameness, right?
Oh,
there's a sameness of experience.
Best one, I'm pretty sure I'm getting this right. If I get this wrong, I apologize. But Tom Frank did a column in The Guardian. Obviously, I was feeling happy one day, so I decided to read The Guardian just to destroy
mellow out
any sense of happiness
uppers and downers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a George Monbiot column in there today, which is like, we're actually ending the world. You're like, oh, for you wake up in the morning, who the fuck wants to read this? I mean, seriously, enough, right? So, I mean, this is, we can get into this if you want, right? I really want to write a book on the left and technology. Because the left's story on technology is the following. We're all going to die, right? That's it. That's all there is, right? There's nothing to it, right? So the notion that, maybe we could all benefit from a massive productivity boost.
Right.
Nope, gone, right? Robots will take all the job. This is called the lump of labor fallacy. It's been around for 300 years. It's been wrong every time. Every time there's been a major technological evolution, labor markets markets have got bigger rather than smaller. But
Right.
no, but there's a certain amount of work to be done, and if the robots do it, there's nothing for else to do. What?
Yeah.
It's complete garbage, but we're stuck in that mentality. Anyway, segue back. My favorite one is this Tom Frank column. Somebody took the hack from the DNC emails and geolocated where the place names that they talk about and then frequency ranked them, right? So what was the most talked about place in the DNC hack?
I can't even guess.
Martha's Vineyard.
No.
Better. What's number 2?
Probably, the Hamptons.
East Hampton. You got it. That's it, right? What's number 3? Pretty sure I'm getting this right.
Yeah. Hyannisport or something like that.
No. Then it becomes San Francisco.
San Francisco? Yeah,
Right?
yeah. It's
Then
amazing.
I think it was New York.
Yeah.
Then maybe Miami or something like that.
Yeah.
But basically any place real, like your Cincinnati's, like etc.
Yeah.
They're like
Not
2 standard
even in the-
deviations off in the
exactly,
tail.
yeah.
Right. That's it. So that's it. That's their Dunbar. Right. That's the Dunbar group for these guys, right?
Yep.
And they purport to come out and tell people how the world is for them.
That's right.
And that's that epistemic arrogance.
Yep.
Right? It's just like, kidding me.
Also, I mean, in general, if we want to look internationally, that's what the United States has done for a long time to the rest of the world as well.
Absolutely.
And the point is that essentially, I may not know all these fancy words or these fancy concepts you're saying, but I know that what you're saying doesn't match my lived
reality,
experience.
Absolutely, my lived experience.
That's right.
And really that's it. I mean, now this is the other side of the internet, right? And the other side of YouTube and all this stuff is that we are able to create effective connections with people that we'll never meet face to face. But we can touch them and touch their lives and communicate in a way which is actually deeply personal. So take away the self-assortative stuff and all the rest of it, this distortion of the dopamine hits, etc. Right?
Right.
There's a way in which you can create these deeply effective connections, right? So people who I'll never meet watch a video that I recorded in Lincoln, Nebraska, and they say, yeah, that really makes sense to me. Or they write me and say, you're full of shit, right?
Right.
And I don't really care which way. I'm not in it for the affirmation. But the fact is, that's what people are able to do. They're sharing what their lived experience is.
That's right.
Now, the question then becomes, why is it the sort of the elites that run the world are so tone deaf to those same experiences? So I tweeted a picture yesterday, I don't know if you saw it. It's from Davos. And it's like, I just put it out as I think I put the caption on it. Everything that's wrong with the people who run what's wrong, everything that's wrong with the people who run the world in one picture. And it's a security guard from Securitas, right? And it says, delegates, breakfast, a day in the life of a refugee, lunch. No, you go on Twitter, look at it. It's just like, you're shitting. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
That's it. Let's see then. 8 o'clock breakfast. Maybe I'll do some Chanel shopping while I'm here. They've got a nice boutique downtown. Then I'll do a day in the life of a refugee. That'll make me feel really connected to the world.
When I'm well fed, I mean, yeah.
No, it's a bit like, so I've never been a fan of the films of Mike Lee because I've always thought to a certain degree it's rubbernecking on the poor, right? And Davos, when it does this stuff, or any of these sort of summits, it's sort of like people who are never affected by the things that they're talking about and have no skin in the game at all regarding those things, reflecting on them in a content and consequence-free environment. And there's just, it's like watching a Mike Lee film. I'm like, I need to stop now.
Well, I mean, so I'm going to butcher the story, but my father went to the University of Chicago, and he was there with Milton Friedman.
Awesome.
And he remembers there's this amazing experience that he had where, they were talking about something, and my father said something about how he couldn't afford some economic problem, and he couldn't afford a Jaguar. And then Milton Friedman pipes up and says, Mr. Motts, economists do not afford things, they prefer things.
And thereby the problem of distribution and equity completely disappears. Nice.
And he said, you may prefer to eat rather than having a Jaguar, but it would never be that you couldn't afford to eat. And that's the reality is that, I mean, there are these very interesting things. And, again, Austerity does such a good job of laying them out where, you have reframed the narrative in such a way. Okay, let's make an assumption that there is never any such thing as shortage. Right? Because if there's limitless wealth, then we never have to think about, oh, wait, like this is an infinite pie. Therefore, I could take as large of a slice as I want.
So long as it's growing. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Or, there's the externalities. Externalities are always local. They're never global. So you can't actually have a genuine planetary emergency environmental crisis.
That's right.
And then you end up hoping for the technological Hail Mary pass to save you, because that's what you do when you assume away the problem, right? Yeah, there's lots of examples of that. But again, go back to human cognition and sort of what little we know about it, but what we do know about it that's reasonably robust, is that, our local consciousness is really strong. And a lot of it is sort of inherited knowledge in the sense that cultural knowledge becomes really important. And, even in sort of professions and thinking about complex systems like the economy or whatever, we make these simplifying assumptions, in a sense, with the best of reasons. You want to basically simplify, strip away so you can get to something essential that you don't know about. I mean, that's what modeling tries to do. But then because we're human, we forget that. And that becomes the thing in and of itself. And then you end up basically kind of like thinking in terms of the abstract rather than the concrete. And
that's right.
That's when it gets more than a bit dodgy.
Yeah, there's a guy, Adam Hansen, who we've had on the podcast a couple of times, and he does innovation and specifically, using all of this cognitive neuroscience to make innovation more effective. And he has this great term, dumb-barring, right? Which is where there's something outside of your Dunbar number, you've created a stereotype, and then you think that stereotype is reflective of the group, right?
Wow, that's good.
So essentially, if you're like, I watch TV, I see ISIS, therefore that is what most Muslims are like.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And, constantly, I think part of, what this moment in history requires is that, Reed Nicewonder, who's filming this, he does what's called street epistemology, which is essentially you go out, you have conversations with people, and you're trying to get them to reflect on what do you believe, why do you believe it,
right.
And we're all going to have to be constantly practicing this epistemology of checking out our own narratives. Do we really know what we're talking about? How much do we know?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
How can we start to evolve narratives that work well for everybody? Because if the narratives don't work well for everyone, then what ends up happening is that people are like, well, fuck this system. Let's tear this apart and build another one. And you had the immortal line, now immortal, 2 years on, that the Hamptons is not a defensible position.
I think that Peter Thiel took that to heart and bought a place in New Zealand. I think I was actually directly responsible for that. So I'd like to apologize to the New Zealand government. My bad on that one. There we go.
But that is what ends up happening is that, you look at what Peter Thiel did there, right? Is that rather than like, oh, fuck, the system isn't working for billions of other humans, let's try and create a better system. It's
let's
like,
build a bunker in New Zealand.
Let's get a fucking bolt hole in New Zealand so I don't have to deal with that shit.
So, we haven't spoken about this, but I think this is what lies behind both gold bugs and also the contemporary equivalent, which is cryptocurrencies.
Yeah.
So people are either trying to make a fast buck off of volatility or really believe that somehow this new thing is going to solve all these other deep-seated problems, which really have nothing to do with the currency itself. It's like when William Hague ran the Conservative Party in Britain. He ran a disastrous electoral campaign. I think it was in the early 2000s. And the main thing was save the pound, right? So I'll never forget this. You had all these like old white pensioners, right, with wooden placards, as if it was like 1930 or something, coming off these buses with pictures of the pound on it, right? Going, save the pound, save the pound. And literally everyone's like, who's threatening it? Like, who's actually I'm going to take out the pound and shoot it, right? Who's against the pound, right? And it was this complete fiction of like the euro and all this sort of shit, right? Now, years later, what's happened, of course, Brexit.
Yeah.
Right? So, those cultural memes, they have real effects.
That's right.
In themselves, even if they are legitimate nonsense in that sense. It's crazy.
Well, and because our causal reasoning is no better than that of a chimpanzee, right? These narratives can seem plausible within whatever it is that people know.
Right.
And then you add into that, it's funny, like a couple of years ago, we had on Naomi Oreskes, and then Eric Conway, who wrote this book called Merchants of Doubt, right? And Merchants of Doubt is all basically about how they were the tobacco scientists. But the point is now we have merchants of certainty,
Yeah.
right? Which is problematic in its own way, where you peddle a false certainty, whether it's fundamentalism, or whether it's some sort of economic surety that like, oh, it's going to be great, guys. We leave the euro, problem solved,
Yeah, exactly.
all of that.
Or, my favorite one for the foreign policy crew is the Thucydides trap.
Oh,
right.
yeah.
So basically, and we could do this one as well with This Time It's Different, right? So basically, there's been 16 cases in human history, according to Graham Allison, where a rising power and a declining power have met, and then 12 times they've went to war. So why is this? Well, because one fears the other, and blah, blah, blah. Thucydides on Sparta, the rise of Sparta, right? This rather completely ignores the following. Number one, the entrainment and connectivity of the world now is such that everybody loses in a way that never would happen before, right? Big punch-up war, everybody dies, right? But perhaps more important than that, people might learn from shit.
Yeah.
Right? They might go, oh, there's a thing out there called the Thucydides trap. Let's not do that.
Do that, exactly.
Right? Because I know because what you're saying is, if I can read that book and I still fall into it, I'm a moron.
That's right.
Right? So basically, you have to assume that everybody's a moron. Now,
and that people never learn from history.
And they never learn from their mistakes or anything.
That's right.
And it's an easy sort of thing to say, well, that's true. Most of the time they don't. But consider the following, right? So one of the things I laugh at all the time is like a lot of the food fads. So it's like, well, we need to go back. You need to eat clean, right? We need to have like food like your grandma would know.
Yeah.
My grandma was eating shit with lead in it. I mean, what makes you think the food in the 1920s
was amazing.
Had no inspections, right? There was no USDA, right? Was any better than it is? It's a complete fantasy.
Yeah, Upton Sinclair's Jungle was all about the fact,
absolutely, right? Exactly. Forget Anthony Bourdain, read The Jungle, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So, we have this fantasy version of the world that we're projecting forwards, and if it was like this now, right?
That's right.
And it's not. Think about, human longevity. Right? The biggest problem that we have now in the sustainability of healthcare systems around the world is that we won't fucking die. Right? That's basically it. And you want the healthcare systems to be solvent? My solution is very simple. 3 martinis a day and compulsory smoking for the over 70s. They'll have a fucking ball. And then they all die of one catastrophic illness with a big smile on their face.
It's fucking amazing.
As opposed to, let's spend 30% of GDP with everybody in a home,
Yeah.
So I was at the gym the other day. On Tuesday, and I was on this rowing machine. Yeah. And I look up and there's this monitor, and I'm looking at this advert, and it says it's a thing called A Place for Mom. And it was that moment where I was truly terrified. And a Place for Mom is a referral service for when your mom's lost the plot and you want to get her out of the house but she won't die. So it had these pictures of these homes, these care homes. Yeah. And one of them was it looked like a faculty club. For those of you who've never been inside a university, a faculty club is like the restaurant from hell with shitty food from an airport, right? And it was this big round tables with all these women with grey hair and men who are decrepit. And I just saw myself looking at this, and I'm just on this machine going, may I have a heart attack at a good age? May I just go out in one, because I do not want that as my future, right? Yeah. So in a sense, we've been so successful in so many ways that we're creating problems like that. Yeah. So, there's so much, even with climate change, even with everything else, particularly the left, of which I count myself a member of, right? We've got all we have is disaster narratives. It's pathetic, right? Yeah. Anyone can say the world's going to end. They've been saying it since the minute the world was born.
Well, and who wants to join a doomsday cult?
Exactly.
Doomsday cults are not fun.
They're not fun, and everybody does die.
And everybody does die.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Because you never move past dealing with the doomsday to okay, how are we going to build things?
Exactly. How are we going to create? How are we going to communicate? Right? Yeah. How are we actually going to get on the same page? Because if you're not willing to actually say that half the country are irredeemable, what was the word again? Not the irredeemable.
Deplorables.
Deplorables and reprobates, right? And therefore you're morally right and they're just wrong. I don't know what you do when you get to that point. You just have a race war and knock it all out. I mean, what's the public policy solution to doing that?
But the deplorables was one of those moments like Gaddafi's son with his fingers. It's okay, now we're really clear on how you feel about us.
That's it.
You've been dancing around about it for a long time.
That's it.
Now we fucking know.
Now
we're going to chop off your fingers.
Hence why, deplorable and proud of it.
That's right.
Absolutely, right? So unless you're willing to get past this, right, then, why enter the conversation in this?
That's right. Well, and also, there's no understanding that, other people might have different priorities. I actually thought one of in An Inconvenient Truth, there's this great moment where they have George H.W. Bush, the one conservative voice in the entire documentary. And it's just a clip of him saying, this Al Gore guy, if he has his way, will be up to our necks in owls and Americans out of jobs. And right there, it is everything you need to know about why the left has not been able to sell global warming to the right. Like, when people on the right see a polar bear drowning, they think, what a wasted opportunity. A perfectly good polar bear died and nobody got to shoot it. Right? And the point is what they care about is jobs. So if you tell me how dealing with global warming is going to create jobs for me, which is my primary concern, then we can start to have a productive conversation.
I totally agree. And, people say, but I've got a different story for you, because what about Europe? So they have these big welfare states.
That's right.
They don't have to worry about joblessness to the same extent, and they are just as deplorable. They've got the Le Pens, all the rest of it.
That's right.
I mean, here's the interesting thing about this one. That's absolutely true and false simultaneously. Here's why. While it's true that aggregate spending in these big welfare states is held up, they tax and spend 50% of GDP.
Right.
Guess where most of it goes? Pensions. Because we're all getting older. So bigger and bigger shares of the budget are going old people, and old people vote. So guess what? Their pensions are inflation protected. So what does that mean for spending on everything else, which would be training, labour mobility, etc., education? That's where it all gets snipped. Right? So basically there has been a residualization even in those big welfare states, which are affecting in a very similar way, but to a lesser extent, exactly the same sort of concerns that you got with the Trump bloc.
Right.
They have no welfare state. They have no safety net. If they don't have a job, they die. And you can look at the case Deaton data on this, right? They're dying. This is what the opiate addiction thing is, etc. Right? So that whole thing is there. They need jobs. That is the most important thing. If you then start coming out with bullshit like, but iPads are getting cheaper, and maybe we need to think about a post-work world, right? You're not going to win anything except contempt.
That's right. And so in terms of that, I mean, we now, the question is, how do we start to evolve those narratives? And I mean, the whole reason why we're doing mixed mental arts, why we're here, is to start to build out community where ultimately I don't really care what the narrative ends up being, right? Like, if it approximates reality pretty damn well and we can all work around it, that's great, because I mean, in terms of, and this comes out of, my direct family experience, right? My father's family were all doctors for a very long time. They incrementally built up wealth. And then in the, early 1900s, they basically went to some financial advisor and said, we want to put our money in the safest possible place.
And he was radio stocks.
Well, he said bonds, national bonds, which are super safe. And he said, you want to invest in the oldest, most stable empires possible.
The Habsburgs,
the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Russians.
Nice.
Yeah, and so, they ended up, all blew up, and, they ended up with all these worthless bonds stacked in their basement. They kept on hoping the communists would be like, listen, not only were we wrong, but we're going to honor these.
We're going to pay you back 10 cents on the dollar, right?
And so, the reality is then they had to burn all those bonds for kindling in World War II.
Right.
And, again, so the point is I very much understand on a personal family level that you better make the system work, because the Hamptons is not a defensible position.
It certainly is not.
Yeah. So in terms of that, we need to really, build basically, I mean, I think we're very much in that place of, like the American Revolution, where you have to incrementally, from the most fundamental level, start building up narratives. Let's clarify our assumptions about human nature. Let's clarify what our goals are, and let's just keep testing our narratives. And, we would love to have you involved in any way that you would want to be involved.
So long as I get to be prime dictator.
Well, that is good. There's going to be some competition for that, because Brian Callen also wants to be prime dictator.
Could we do it? I'll do Tuesdays.
Or actually, no, here's probably what would work really well. You can have all power, because Brian doesn't actually want to run things.
Okay.
He just wants to be the sort of titular figurehead that eats cheese and plays tennis.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah,
that's great.
so
I'll be the guy who walks around with these shades. Constantly on a cell phone.
Yeah, that's good.
I'll just be like,
that's good. Okay, good.
I'll be that guy.
Ideal.
But
ideal.
no, but in all seriousness, I mean, regardless of whether we're doing it through the digital venue of podcasts, whether we're actually getting off our backsides and going to talk to people.
That's right.
I mean, that's the only thing that really makes sense to me at this point in time. So, just, I say this to academics all the time, they're great at diagnosing things, and then they forget to tell people the diagnosis. So get beyond diagnosis to prognosis to recovery.
That's right.
And go out and do it.
Well, you have to turn theory into practice, because otherwise, like every idea, like when it's in the abstract in the ivory tower, fine, but then try and put it into practice in reality and see what actually happens.
So here's a nice little one a friend of mine's involved with. The US Small Business Association has figured out that there's about $2 trillion in baby boomer business related assets that don't have an heir.
That's pretty amazing.
It's amazing, isn't it? Now imagine if you could set up a fund that would buy up those assets relatively cheap, and then you could set up co-ops in cities which are not your hub cities, in your Baltimores, in your, not even Pittsburgh, because they're doing quite well, but you know, in your second tier cities which have a young population, right? And you could basically transfer ownership and turn that sort of debt into equity so that you have real functioning businesses that are being transferred and they're earning it out. Right. I mean, there's a way in which Mondragon in Spain has done this for a very long time. If you could take Mondragon and do it to scale, basically with the millennial generation and create assets, that's an incredible way of creating wealth, connectedness, and community.
And the other thing that we have talked a lot about on this podcast and that we're trying to figure out how to move forward is the trades, because there's, you know, those are some of the most automation resistant jobs. And not only that, you know, there's a massive shortage of those employees because we've all been sold on this narrative that if you want a good life, you have to go to college and study African American studies because that's where real prosperity lies. So I think there are lots and lots of ways. And I mean, you know, one of the conversations, there's a guy, John Aguilar, who's a stonesmith. He does basically mortarless dry stone.
Right.
And, you know, part of the conversation that we've had both on this podcast and offline is that essentially all those resources to learn whatever you need to learn exist on YouTube. They exist on the internet. You can find apprenticeships. You know, Mike Rowe has been doing a lot of this stuff from Dirty Jobs. So it seems to me that in terms of evolution, right, all the pieces of what's needed here exist.
Right.
And it now is just about connecting the dots.
And something else to think about in this one, and this is the other side of the tech story, how much of this is basically Silicon Valley talking their book?
Yeah.
Right. So let's think about, you know, the whole idea of self-driving cars. Right. Now, here's the thing. They always think about the demand side of stuff, the supply side of stuff. We can do this, so it will happen. Right. But when I give talks, I would say to people, so how many of you actually like driving? And fair number. I'm like, come on, really? And 30% put the hand up regularly. So many of you watch Top Gear or the Grand Tour, right? Yeah, right, everybody, right? Well, not everybody, you know, 35%, right? Now, here's the deal. I want you to get rid of that nice new 6-cylinder Volvo T6 350 horsepower you've got and not trade it in for an electric, which is fine, because if it's a Tesla, it's a nice car, right? I want you to just give up. And then you will call from your phone a little shitty plastic bubble from Google. And when you sit in it, they will fry your brain with adverts.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think you're going to want to do this? And certainly 80% of people are like, that's self-driving cars? That, right?
Yeah.
So again, another example of this is if you go back and Google, don't do it now because you have a time machine, right? But Google's a time machine. If you go into Google and write Segway Revolution 2002, you'll find all these amazing articles from the Wall Street Journal and stuff about this changes everything. We're all going to be commuting different, going to change the roads, whatever. Right? All that it took was one person to stand on it with a helmet, and everyone went,
no fucking way.
No chance. No. It's done. It's over, right? Because I look like a mobile phallus, right? To the point that the only people in the world that get to use this now are mall cops, which are it's the only job in the world where derision is part of the job description. Right? That's why you have to use a Segway.
Yeah, exactly.
It's almost necessary.
So you can get away from the taunts.
Right. So anyway, the serious point in all this ridiculous sort of pseudo-tech comedy is that not just, you know, our trade's important or whatever, right? The notion that basically there is no more work, it's the end of work, right? Yeah. And if you don't, so what's the incentive then? I need to buy these tech unicorns now because eventually they'll be the only thing in the world with value. Well, that's nice for the insiders, isn't it? It's like, you know, initial coin offering for digital piece of shit number 7, right?
Right.
Well, if enough fools go chasing it, I guess you could do that stuff, right? So a lot of tech's incredibly important. I take it way more seriously than I used to. I think the left needs a positive story of tech. I think this is a huge part of the community bridging and building that we've been talking about, is incorporation of tech, building real assets for the next generation that they don't have because of the inequality school. You're not going to get it back from the rich.
Right.
They're too damn powerful. You need to make your own assets. That's the story, right? And tech's part of that, but a lot of what's said about tech smells like
shit. So when we hear like this, 47% of jobs are going to be gone in the next 10 years to automation.
See, here's the classic one for this sort of stuff,
Yeah.
right? So there's the rival study by McKinsey. They interviewed something like 2,300 executives whose firms either use or are about to execute AI in their firms, right? And then you read the fine print and you realize that like of that 23,000, only 2% actually have AI. And then you read the fine print and you're like, most executives know no idea what the AI is.
Yeah.
Right? But anyway, you go into this one, and of that survey, 80% of those executives said they expected the introduction of these technologies to increase rather than decrease their workforce. Because I think about it. So I'll give you an example of this. I use this all the time. Apologies to my friend in Providence. I got a buddy who runs a prosciutto factory. It's a family business, right? So big leg of pork, boil it in salt water, hang it from the roof. So the way you used to do this was up on a ladder onto a gantry, pull this big heavy thing off, move it along to another part of the drying room, repeat hundreds of times. This is a horrible physical job, right? This destroys your back, right?
Yep.
Workers' comp is your future, right?
Right.
All that sort of stuff. So my buddy takes over basically with the family business and brings in robots.
Right.
So he absolutely eliminated 40 jobs. They used to have 200, they now employ 600. They got such a productivity boost from doing this. The cost of prosciutto went through the floor.
Yeah.
Consequently, they're able to sell in volume into bigger chains that they could never touch before.
Right.
Now, we never see this. This is an evolutionary problem, right?
Right.
We're really good at remembering everything we've lost.
Yep.
We're unable to imagine the things that we've yet to find.
But also, I mean, just from a cognitive standpoint, right? I understand that these jobs are going away, and I literally don't even know what these jobs that will be created are.
That's exactly
like
the point.
I literally
you have no
can't
idea.
imagine them.
So do this one for a 30-year projection for me, right? This is when I was in front of the Senate talking about debt, which that went, right?
Yeah.
But it said, okay, so imagine you did a 30-year projection. Well, we're going to be bankrupt because of Social Security and all this sort of stuff, right? So imagine in 1986, you just did a 15-year projection as to where the world would be, right? What would you miss? The internet.
Yeah.
The end of the Soviet Union. Tech. All of it. Right?
Yep.
Seinfeld, right? There's no way you would know all the stuff that we take for granted.
Right.
Now we just say, well, that automatically had to happen because, one of the things about cognitive psychology with humans is that we're not just narrative creatures. We turn our narratives into causal stories.
That's right.
So those causal stories become real because they reflect the possibility curve of what we can do next.
Yep.
Right? So this happens, so you don't do this, right? That sort of stuff. So we've built this world, right, where narratives are very incredibly important, and we don't reflect upon how what we're telling ourselves just now about technology in the future is just another goddamn narrative.
That's right. And therefore that, there may be some assumption based into that narrative that means that this doesn't apply, right? We may be, we may think we're standing in the same river, but you can never stand in the same river twice.
Exactly.
Right. So with all of that in mind, I cannot thank you enough for coming out here.
I flew all the way here
to
just
Los
to do
Angeles
this.
to do this, mostly to meet Reed Nicewinder, I know. But we also had, because I do believe in democracy,
Yes.
certainly much more than you or Brian Callen, who seem to be moving this towards some sort of imperial
two terrible
dictatorship.
twins.
Yeah, exactly. The two members of the Sith Lord. Yeah, Siths are always in two. But we did have some questions from the community, and I was wondering if you would mind answering some of them.
I will at least attempt to.
Yeah. Curtis Piallo, I think that's how you say his name. His breakdown of post-World War II economics is great, but I'd like to hear him speak about Basel I, moving off the gold standard, and the stagflation of the 70s in a bit more depth.
God.
Jesus.
Have you got a couple of hours? All right, so here's the thing. The gold thing is, as Keynes called it, a barbaric relic. Currency is... All right, let's think about money. When you do an econ class, they tell you that it's a store of value, right? It's the most important one, right? And then a unit of account and unit of exchange, right? But my friend Eric Lonergan has a little book called Money, which I recommend. Really great little book, sort of philosophy of money type thing.
Yep.
And he says it's a hedge against uncertainty. And for that to be true, it must be worth something in the future.
Right.
So gold is totemic in the sense that we think because you can't manipulate the gold supply, therefore, if currency is tied to it holds its value. But it's totally wrong.
Yeah.
You see, what really matters is that you have a fiscal setup that isn't completely screwed. I don't know, shutting down the government for fun, right? So imagine you have a reasonable fiscal setup and your central bank that prints the money, etc., but the treasury prints it, but the central bank does the monetary management, is reasonably well run. All you need is positive demographics.
Right.
Because if your economy is nothing more than the number of hours worked, the number of people, right, and then output relative to how much technology you've got, That's it, right? So if your technology is relatively constant at any given moment, if your population's falling, then by definition, your economy is shrinking. Now, it doesn't matter at that point whether you're on gold or not. What matters is the intergenerational capacity to tax and to use those revenues wisely to create productivity gains in the future so that your bigger population could be doing things more efficiently. So my point in all this, to try and answer the question, is, the coming off the gold standard, et cetera, we can read too much into this. The fact is we've been off of gold since 1918. Really, the whole Bretton Woods half gold fix was kind of bullshit from the start. And that's kind of the way the world works. And I'm perfectly comfortable with that because it's about institutions of good governance. It's not about sort of the totemic nature of a metal or any of that sort of stuff.
But and this is something that, I've been thinking about, in terms of, so you take all these different academic disciplines and you've divvied them up, and there's a huge amount of territoriality within academia, and therefore what people get to talk about.
Totally.
And, we had Kate Rayworth on the podcast, and just really talking about the fact that it seems to me, my sort of sense of this is that the domain of what we now call economics is money. It's inflation. It's this sort of these very narrow things. And therefore, all the narratives become about sort of this one thing. And there are so many other things that are excluded to the functioning of an economy.
Well, in strict terms, if you're within the corpus of mainstream macroeconomics now, it's actually very hard to generate a puzzle in which distribution is a problem.
Right.
Whereas if you live in planet Earth and open your eyes, there's a big disconnect, certainly. Regarding the stagflation thing, if our friend wants any more, a piece I published in the Review of International Political Economy goes into that in depth. So I don't want to belabor that here, but essentially stagflation wasn't really stagflation. What happened was you generated enough inflation that businesses couldn't force productivity gains to keep up with wages. Labor then basically wanted a higher real wage in the face of inflation. The only way business could accommodate this was by constantly pushing up prices, which meant more inflation, which hit their profit. So essentially they went on a capital strike. So investment fell at the same time as inflation was high, so unemployment started to rise. So the way that we think about this, traditionally this so-called collapse of the Phillips curve, is just a silly way to think about it. It's actually, there's a sort of what's called a Kaleckian framework, which explains it much better, and that's how I tend to think about it.
Right. So Ray Baskerville, given his recent comments on the irrelevance of politics, I'd like to hear his thoughts on where he sees the agency for social change lying, and get him reflecting more in the MMA wheelhouse of a holistic perspective of cultural currents. Well, I think you already did that on this podcast.
I think that podcast just did that one. Thank you very much.
So the to Ray's question, where do you see the agency for social change lying? It would seem to be in actual face-to-face conversations, podcasting, having, creating actual jobs.
Yeah, well, all of that. But actual agency happens with actual agents.
Right.
And, we have this sort of, the left has a nostalgia for if it doesn't have a union badge on it, it's not agency. And, and the right has a sort of, how can I put it, all that matters is catering to the interests of the 1% version of agency. I think there's a huge amount we can do in the middle of that.
Yep. Di Canfield's next question, I think you also answered these incredibly well.
Excellent.
Do you believe that humans are in fact emotionally driven?
Yes.
Yes. Do you believe that humans are currently mostly influenced and money driven?
Oh, that's a good one. There's a good book from a few years ago called The Spirit Level, right? And it makes this claim that one of the reasons for the rise in obesity across the world is because of the rise of stress hormones like cortisol.
Yeah.
And the way that you satiate this in the short term is basically by binge eating, binge drinking, and shopping. And in order to do all that, you need money. So I would tell the story that way, that we've sort of hollowed out the value in our lives and we plug it in with these consumptive acts.
Yep.
And then those consumptive acts require a cash flow. And in that way, I think that we've become money obsessed. But I think it's a means to an end because our ends have become perverted. And
I think also the other thing is that money has become the proxy for status, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's a super easy heuristic. Like it's very hard for me to accept, I meet Mark Blyth, never met him before, don't really know what his work is. It's very hard for me to, gauge your status in the community. but there's this amazing one number metric where I can gauge your importance.
Right, exactly.
And that's a large part of what it happens.
Well, another thing that's particular to the US, so if you go to Denmark, for example, pretty much the information you can get on people is amazing, right? So you get their income, you get their tax returns, right? You can calculate the sort of the net value of a zip code, right? All this sort of stuff. And sociologists over there have done all this stuff and network mapped it and all this sort of stuff. It's incredible, right? Now here, you know, Trump is emblematic of this, right? I'm not giving you my tax returns, right? So in a sense, you know, everybody lies.
Yeah.
Right. It's a bit sort of like, you know, students at colleges. So when I was at Johns Hopkins, right, Johns Hopkins students are acutely aware of the fact that they didn't get into an Ivy. So what that means is if I say to them, you're all going to read Keynes' General Theory by tomorrow, they'll do it. Because they think if they don't do that and also run the World Bank at the age of 19 as an intern and then work for Pixar on production the next year and work for Citibank the next year, they're all going to die poor, alone and homeless, you know, in an alleyway somewhere because they didn't get into Harvard, right? So we play these intense status games with each other. And the way that we cope with it is by lying.
Yeah.
Because the amount of bullshit that people talk. So I saw a report of a study, I didn't see the actual study, that estimates that around 30% of the content of CVs are just outright lies. Right. So that's how, so basically we have money to do this and we have bullshit to do this, and that's what pushes a lot of it forward. Not very healthy.
No. So, and I think the interesting thing again about the internet is that bullshit is far harder to pull off, because lurking around the internet are the little pieces of evidence that reveal the lie of your bullshit. Right,
but then there's also the fact that you can segment into communities whereby all I want to do is affirm that the bullshit's true because I like that idea too.
And to disregard anybody who tries to you know, hang your bullshit out to dry.
Yeah, so you know, the old line about Scottish Marxists come to mind. He was never a man to let mere facts get in the way of a good ideology.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know,
absolutely. Okay, so what are more important incentives besides money that will rise in the future?
That's future forecasting. I tend not to do that.
Okay, good. So Michael Murphy, but you know he's a real Irishman, so he even has the accent on the Michael.
On the Michael.
On the Michael. I'd like to ask Blyth about his friend Nassim Nicholas Taleb's work on dynamic inequality, the pace at which who are the one in the 1% change.
Right.
Yeah.
So I get the point about what's called ergodicity, right? That basically there's a kind of a dynamism and that people in the top shift. But I also live in a world in which, you know, I teach in an elite institution. And so let's just do this as a thought experiment. What counts as dynamic inequality for somebody in the middle of Kentucky or Dundee is radically different from somebody who's living in, let's say, Providence or Harvard Yard.
Yeah.
So if you are born into one of those sets, then you can cycle in and out, but your chances of failure are very, very small.
Oh, if you're insulated from failure.
You're insulated from, and if you're in one of those out positions, Kentucky or Dundee, your chances of even getting into that to fail are actually radically different. So I accept the point as sort of like being true in a sense of mathematical truth.
Yeah.
But on planet Earth, I think it actually hits the ground in a very different way.
Well, and there's also then the knock-on unhealthiness of when you have the elite class who runs things who are insulated from failure, then that leads to a whole bunch of unhealthy psychology where, you know, they have no knowledge.
No, and this is Taleb's other, I think, quite brilliant point about skin in the game.
Yeah.
If you do not bear the consequences of your actions and you're effectively insulated from them, then failure has no meaning.
Of course.
And also reward has no meaning.
That's right. And I mean, there's a profound spiritual emptiness there because your achievements aren't really achievements.
Right, absolutely.
It's all trophies for participation.
So hence, if you go back to the question that was asked, you know, what I think about dynamic inequality and the problem of, you know, cycling in and out, I think that, like, yes, it's true and we really need to think about this, but there's an enormous amount of evidence that suggests that the concentration of income and wealth globally, not just locally, is such that the people who are at the top of that really experience that in a very different way from the vast majority of others.
Yeah, and I think one of the points that Michael brought up, which I thought was really interesting, is that, you know, he said that I should ask you about IQ because there has been this resurgence of IQ, and it's essentially a use of the narrative of IQ to justify why we are the ruling elite. That essentially this is, I don't know if
I'm not counting, no.
So there are all these people.
I think people would know that if I saw this, I'd get so angry, bad things would happen. But
well, so you know Charles Murray,
right?
Yeah. So Charles Murray has floated back onto the scene. He came back from wherever he was.
It's like Banquo's ghost.
That's And there's a series of YouTubers like Stefan Molyneux, and then also Jordan Peterson, who's another huge internet phenomenon, really believes that the IQ research is really robust, and if we start questioning the IQ research, then you have to question all the psychology.
So the claim is basically the best and the brightest are the best and the brightest because they're the best and the brightest.
That's right.
All right. So, okay, let's say that's true. There's two ways to interpret this. Number one, you have more resources and you're better at taking tests.
That's right.
Number two. Number two, you might be brighter. That doesn't mean you'll make any better judgments.
No.
So my favorite president, probably didn't have the highest IQ, is Harry Truman.
Yeah.
So Harry Truman was a 4-time failed haberdasher who was dominated by his mother-in-law.
Yeah.
He was a machine rake politician who was put in place by corrupt money.
Yeah.
And he saved the New Deal, cemented stability in the Cold War, and pushed the Republicans that were going to destroy all of that into a box, and was re-elected when everyone said there was no chance in hell he was going to get it. Now, was he the best in the brightest? Was he the highest in IQ?
No.
So this whole thing about sort of the the most, it's the Clinton line, the most qualified. I don't, in the context of governing, I don't even know what that means.
No.
It literally makes no sense to me. It's as if the whole world, there's no politics here, right? Where you actually have to make effective value judgments which are immune to IQ.
That's right.
It's all just techne. It's all just, well, there's a problem there, and with the right amount of policy X and policy Y, we can do that. As if the whole world is a smooth linear engineering equation.
Well, and you're assuming
it's incredibly dangerous.
And it's the constant mistaking of your low resolution map for reality. Right?
Yeah, but I mean, I think I'd go further than that. It's sort of like it's a different form of epistemic arrogance that presumes that all problems in the world are not social problems; they're in a sense mechanical problems, and therefore there's a solution out there. It's just that you're too dumb to see it.
That's right.
And then you point out that but your solution means you get to keep everything, and they get crumbs from the table, and they might not like that because they might think that's a bit unfair. Well, that doesn't matter. Like, we're the clever ones.
That's right.
And that type of that's a philosophy. If that's your defense for governing, you've already lost.
That is pretty spot on. Essentially, because it's divine right.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's divine right.
It's genetic lottery plus
That's
divine right.
Yeah. And I mean...
And it's about how you take tests.
Yep.
It's just nonsense.
Well, and also, I mean, the other interesting thing too is, do you know Thomas Sowell?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Sowell has this amazing book, Black Rednecks, White Liberals, right? And one of the big things in there is he says, like, let's just take it at face value, like black people, right, get lower IQ scores on average, right? But there's something that you're missing out here is that you're grouping people based on white and black rather than based on culture.
Right.
And what you find is that 1/3 of white people are rednecks.
Right.
9/10 of black people are rednecks. So what you're really seeing is you're seeing an effect that rednecks don't do well on IQ tests.
Right.
And if you look at, for example, West Indians, or you look at Nigerians, the most highly educated group in the United States, you're going to find out that it's actually a culture effect.
Right, right.
And, whatever you think of the test, the reality is that, this is the most basic thing is that, just because you've observed a pattern, that doesn't mean that that's the correct pattern.
It's also a question of how you cut up the data set.
That's right.
So, I mean, if you cut it up this way, then it says this. If you cut it up this way, then it does something else entirely. No, absolutely.
Yep. We would love, I think also one of the things that we would love just in general is a reading list from you.
Okay.
But we can offline about that. And then why do people continue to believe in stupid economics ideas?
Because of all the things that we've been talking about
in this podcast.
Exactly.
So basically,
it's
guess,
narratives.
Yeah.
We live in a world. See, this is the thing. Political science just now, which is my home discipline in a sense, right? But I'm not, let's say, central to the work there. I'm more sort of flitting on the boundaries of economics and other things. But anyway. They're obsessed with, along with microeconomists, with like causal inference, right? So the thing that is causal inference, you got to show causal inference. So you do all these, you torture the statistics and you run experiments and you do all these complex things, and then you can show that really in this one instance, this is the cause of this. Now the cause is usually trivial, non-replicable, etc., but its cause we can hang our hat on that, right? People don't give a damn about cause, right?
Yeah.
The story I like to tell, I've been telling recently, is one my grandmother used to say, which is, there was a woman down the bottom of the road, she had terrible headaches or migraines. And one day somebody said to her, that cats help? She goes, well, do you know what I mean? I've got a cat. No, pick up the cat and rub it on your head, right? And the next day it'll be gone. And it was.
Yeah.
So that was it. So whenever she got a headache, what she did was she rubbed the cat on her head, and the next day the headache went away.
Yeah.
So cats cure headaches, right? That's obviously nonsense, but it doesn't actually help her to tell her that what's really going on is some kind of biochemical event in her brain. Right? She's quite happy with that narrative. She's going to go with that narrative. That's kind of what works.
Yeah.
Because we're humans, because we're stupid. Right? That's how it works. You got to work with the dough the bread's made from.
That's right. And I mean, ultimately, it really comes down to, are you trying to get humans to fit into your theory, or are you trying to get your theory to fit humans?
Yeah, or are you trying to basically turn human interactions and what humans do into this kind of engineering process?
Mm-hmm.
And, I think a large part of what sort of the technical academy, if you will, the sort of the nudge perspective in economics, et cetera, is trying to do is basically treat people as kind of like little sort of like bits of data in a machine learning problem.
Mm-hmm.
And, we push it that way and we sort the data that way and we figure out what to do and when we have our technical solution and we all move on. And I think that's, profoundly disrespectful of the types of relationships that we're meant to have with each other by recognizing each other as sort of like human subjects.
Do you, how well do you know Gulliver's Travels?
Not since the kiddie version of the TV program, to be perfectly honest.
Do you know the story of the Laputans and the Belle and the Barbie?
Probably, but I've forgotten. Why don't you tell me?
So this is one of the countries that
location,
Well, so the Laputans are the academics who live on this giant floating island that is levitated by a giant magnet, and it was all based on the Royal Academy in the 1700s. And they all walk around with one eye pointed up to the zenith, right? And they have retainers who follow them around with inflated bladders. And every time they need to pay attention to something, they whack them on the head. And for a second, they're back in reality and they're sort of paying attention and they eat or whatever. But they spend their time thinking about math and music and all of these abstractions, and their clothes are a disaster and all of that. And they focus on all sorts of theoretical problems like how to extract sunbeams from cucumbers, how to turn marble into pillows, and how to reverse engineer shit into food.
Nice.
Right? And these were real things that the Royal Academy was doing in the 1700s.
Awesome.
And they rule over the Belle and the Barbie, who are the peasantry, who are, starving. Nothing works because their leaders are so focused on math and music. And then every time the Belle and the Barbie rebel, the Laputans bring their giant magnetic floating island crashing down upon them because how dare you rebel?
Right.
And then they go back
up.
to, but I mean, it's an amazing, like I remember reading that and being like, wow.
Yeah, that's resonant. That's strangely resonant, isn't it?
Okay, so one last question, and then, we can't thank you enough for
And
your
then
time.
you're free to go.
And then you're free to go. You've answered all questions. So, Absolute, any take on what's happening in China with their shadow banking, manipulated yuan, and any other observations would be great. Watching China with great interest, but not sure what to believe at the moment.
I don't think anybody knows what to believe. So here's how I try and think about China, right? Particularly when it comes to finance. China has two banks. One of them processes US dollars into T-bills, and the other one pays the people in the state-owned enterprises script in the local currency. And both of them sort of like intermediate dollar earnings from Walmart. It's a very simple way of thinking about it. Now, they don't really have a banking system. They have a giant shadow banking system. That is to say, a multiplicity of very different, poorly regulated, non-transparent, non-deposit taking financial intermediaries, if you want to use the language. In other words, it's a shit show.
Yeah.
And it comes in all flavors. Now, here's the deal. This is China. People don't take this seriously enough. They're communists, right? And what I mean by the following is, what I mean by that is, it's not as if sort of these guys were there in the 1980s and went, we've checked out the Soviet Union thing, didn't really work. Let's just be capitalists, right? What they did was they said, we really need to get through capitalism as fast as possible because we actually still believe in this thing called socialism. And if you think I'm wrong, think about the way that they think about environmental problems. China has installed more solar in the past 2 years than the US has. Simple fact. Let's think about what they did at Foxconn, which is a private company. 50,000 jobs gone, replaced by robots. Done. Why? Because you don't need them. You can use that labor elsewhere in the economy, right? All those empty apartments that were built, that like the Australians in particular were doing documentaries on these crazy Chinese building all these apartments, right? Well, there was 100 million people that built the Chinese sort of second industrial revolution, the oil population. They're living in those apartments now.
Yeah.
So they have a banking system. It's probably got a lot of bad debt in it. So we think there's a thing called a resolution mechanism. What we'll do is we'll identify the good assets and the bad assets, and we'll put them in the bad bank and the good bank, and then we'll do this and da. And the idea that like the Chinese government, who does what the Chinese government does, is in any way at all going to take some kind of Basel-approved playbook, dump it down on their financial sector, and play by those rules, forget it. They still sit on about $3.1 trillion of dollar assets. And even if we talk it down by 20%, there's nowhere else to go, really. You want to overbid the euro, knock yourself out, right? So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to build a Silk Road, you're going to do all this sort of stuff, but you're also going to resolve your banking system. And it will be done, and it won't be very messy, and it will be very, very rapid, and it will cost a lot of money, and a lot of things will be shut down, and some people you will never hear from again, and they will do it in the way that they handle most problems.
Right.
Very effectively.
Well, on that note, I look forward to living under your dictatorship.
Excellent.
I think it's going to be wonderful. And even if it's not wonderful...
Remember, I'm the guys like this. We will take out the one called Hunter.
Oh, no.
Take out the one called Hunter.
Just listen, whatever orthodoxy you want me to adhere to so that I can have whatever you think is fair.
Yes,
I mean, that
exactly,
is the correct way to live.
And seriousness in closing, right? I mean, there's two things that I've never really wanted to do. One is run anything in finance because I have no gambling gene. It just doesn't appeal to me at all. And that's why I can analyze it intellectually. I find it fascinating, but I just don't want to do it. And the other one is rule people. You know, I have no desire for this. There was a Scottish comedian who came over here in the 1980s and did a few things called Billy Connolly.
I know Billy Connolly. He's amazing.
Oh, it's great, right? So Billy had this joke from years ago. It's very simple. He's not the first person to say it. But he says, has anybody ever thought that the desire to run for public office should in itself be the automatic disqualification? and that's it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I can honestly say, I have never had that ambition. So there was at one point, somebody had posted something on the internet or something that I was going to run for a Senate seat.
Yeah.
Right? And I was like, and I'm racking my brain for like any drunken conversation I could have had where you know, I'd done 15 tequilas and I maybe thought that was a good idea, right? Never. No, you're safe from my dictatorship. Totally safe.
But see, the problem is that even a threesome with 2 porn stars while your wife is pregnant is not enough to disqualify you from the highest office in the land.
Yeah, that's true, actually. But
you're going to have to do some really crazy shit.
But
after
the strange thing is, I've never desired that one either. So we're okay.
Mark Blyth, thank you so much.
A pleasure.
And
I love LA. I love Venice Beach, Palm Springs. God, I love it. I'm actually riffing Snoop Dogg from Katy Perry there at that point, just in case anybody wanted to know. But there we go.
But, we'd love to have you back on the show.
Yes.
Let us know any books that you recommend and anything we can do to...
Just wait till I finish my next 2 books.
What are your next 2 books?
Yeah, well, there's the one with Eric Lonergan just now, which has got such a good title, I can't tell you what it is.
Oh, that's good.
And that hopefully will be ready and out by the end of the year, if not sooner. And then I really want to do this book on technology and the left. I want us to have a constructive, positive story about taking what are exactly, particularly in the face of an aging population and massive expenditures going forward, we need much more productivity.
That's right.
And that's how you get it. And like to simply have this like, oh, we're all going to die and be replaced by robots. It's just totally stupid. So we need to get past that. So I hope to do something positive in that space.
Well, I think, we will offer any support that you want, whether it's like finding interesting things that are going on, we can send them your way.
That's always good.
Yeah.
Exactly. So long as it doesn't involve 3 porn stars, we'll be fine.
Perfect.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much.
Cheers.